Excellent. Welcome everyone to our masterclass on the old vines of South America, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you especially, I've got three winemakers with me in the middle of harvest, so thank you very much Emily Faulkner, André Vignoni and Julio Buchon for coming to explain to us about the diversity of old vines in South America and why this is an incredible continent to discover through the wines made from these old vines. Before we get started, I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm Amanda Barnes. I've been living in South America for 10 years and specialize in writing about the wine regions. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to how these old vines arrived to South America. So the Americas were the first real wine region planted with vines in the New World. And the first vines arrived in the second mission of Christopher Columbus in 1493, when he brought cultivars of olives, wheat, and vines, and started planting these vines throughout Central America and up through North America and throughout South America. So even though the vines were first planted at the end of the 1400s, our first records of winemaking really started in the 1500s. And in Mexico and up through North America, it's from 1574 that we have the first records, whereas in South America, it starts a bit earlier in Peru from the 1540s, Bolivia and Chile from the 1550s, Argentina from the 1560s. Brazil is a slightly different story, and Uruguay as well, because although vines did arrive in the early 1500s, and there's records of winemaking from the 1550s, it kind of stopped quite quickly because of the challenging, more humid climate. But where these vineyards really thrived is in the western corridor of the South American continent and along the Andes. And we've got this incredible diversity of old vines here, and also some really old vines. So when we talk about old vines, Wine Australia has this really interesting classification where they start talking of old vines at 35 years old plus. They start talking about survivor vines at 70 years plus, centenarian vines at 100 years plus, and ancestors as over 125. And in South America, we have some vines still in production from the 1700s, and lots of vines in the 1800s, planted in the 1800s, and lots of vines planted from the 1900s. And our real hotspots are Bolivia in the traditional valley of Sinti, Tarija, which is a bit further south, and also now the kind of main wine region. And Peru, we've got it all along the coast, so from Lima further south down to the border with Chile. And Argentina, it's all along the Andean corridor with some real kind of incredible old vine regions in Salta, especially in Mendoza, which is the heartland of Argentine wine production, San Juan and Rio Negro in the kind of gateway to Patagonia. And in Chile, as Julio is going to discuss, and Emily as well, they're really spread everywhere. The great concentration is in the south, from Maule, Etata, and Biobío, but we have some really old vines up to the Atacama and on the border with Peru as well, still in production and making some interesting kind of sweet wines too. In terms of the kind of concentration of old vines, I think often South America goes under the radar for the New World because we talk a lot about South Africa and their old vine registrar, which actually registers from 35 years plus, so starting at a younger age, where there's around 3,000 hectares. In Australia, of the survivor vines, which are over 70, there's almost 600 hectares. But in Chile and Argentina, we've got a lot more registered. So in Argentina, the statistics show that over 7,400 hectares of vines, were planted from before the 1950s. So that makes them over 70 years old. And Chile, we don't have the same records for that year of plantation, but we do know that over 15,000 hectares are unirrigated bush vines, which would typically be 70 or older. The reason that I think a lot of these old vines have gone under the radar is because they are Criollo vines, which is a whole different family of varieties, which aren't planted anywhere else. And these are all descendants from the original vines that were planted by the Spanish, and mainly from two parents, Listán Prieto, which is Criolla Chica or Pais as it's known in Chile, and Moscatel de Alejandría, Muscat of Alexandria. And from this, we've got over 56 classified grape varieties from this Criollo family, but undoubtedly many, many more. And they're common throughout Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. And they're also made not only into wines, but they're also really important in spirits production. In Peru, especially for pisco, and also in Chile, and in Bolivia for Singani. One of the kind of real highlights of old vine South America, in my opinion, is Bolivia, not necessarily in quantity, but certainly in its interesting quality. So here we've got some pictures of some of the old vine muscat and also some of the other Criollo vines, which are typically trained around trees, and most typically the moye tree, which is the pink peppercorn tree. And this was a system which was brought in by the Jesuits. And they call it the tutor, and so the vines grow up around the trunks of these trees. And not only does it create this incredible support system, which enables these vines to last for centuries, because many of them are over 200 years old, but they also give this unique character to the wines and this slightly spicy complexity. And in Argentina, kind of moving down south from Bolivia, we also get a real spot for old vines in Salta in the north, in the Calchaquí valleys in particular. And I've got a video here which the viticulturist from El Esteco, Francisco, took a video this morning from the vineyard, and he's going to talk to us briefly about the typical viticulture methods there and why it's really important for Torrontés. So if I just open this and we'll shoot into the vineyard with Francisco from El Esteco. Oops, or right to the end.
Welcome to the north of Argentina. Welcome to Cafayate. I'm inside El Esteco estate in a plot of Torrontés that was originally planted with Criolla at the end of the 19th century, in 1892. At that time, the Criolla represented more than the 50% of the Calchaquí vineyards. And then in the middle of the 20th century, started to be replaced by other varieties like the Torrontés. The trellis system is the pergola, that is the ancient one that was introduced in the north of Argentina in the 16th century. And with this trellis system that is still remaining in many places in Argentina and also in the north, we have the bunches protected from direct sunlight, from excessive exposure to the sunlight. And we can obtain a lot of freshness and floral profiles in our wines. The irrigation in this case is flood. So it's a traditional way of irrigating. The water is flowing by the surface coming from the Andes. And this is a very traditional way of managing these plots.
Excellent. So Torrontés is probably for most people the old vine from South America that they will certainly have tasted, but it isn't the most planted. We're actually going to move to Julio, who's going to be the first to present, and look at Pais, which is the oldest vine, one of the first vines brought to South America, and the most planted in South America today, with significant plantings in Chile. So Julio, if you'd like to introduce yourself and also talk a bit about Pais. I think, Bouchon Family Wines has been incredible in really spearheading the Pais Renaissance and making some delicious wines from this really old and important variety for the continent. So thank you for joining us. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you're going to say about Pais.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for the invitation. It's an amazing opportunity to introduce we call it the real Chile and Argentina. That most of the time our countries are well known because of the good prices, good quality wines, but not really interesting somehow, lacking of some personality, And I think talking about these old vines is all about the history, is all about the personality. Pais has a very important role in the Chilean viticulture or the South American viticulture, because for 300 years, more or less, it was the only variety and at the beginning cultivated by the church, for these religious purposes, and then spread out for like farmers making small plantations, 1 hectare, 2-3 hectares for own consumption, for to drink at home. So this is the way for these 300 years we had this Pais variety in the country, and the people used to drink this wine in the farm for work. It's part of the food, it's part of the culture. But then when the French arrived, more or less in 1850, the wealthy people, they brought French knowledge, French winemakers, French technology, and also varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon mainly. And then this history of Pais was almost gone. So the beautiful history of 300 years was gone in this second part of the, let's say, the Bordeaux-oriented industry. I don't like to call it industry, but we normally, the Chileans, we call the industry, and it's very influenced by the French Bordeaux guys. So then the Pais and the other varieties involved, like Carignan, Sanso, it was used for bulk. So the big wineries will use it for the base of the bulk, and they will pay little small amount of money for these producers. So it was in a big risk of disappear. So for us, it's very important to work with the Pais because we are preserving the part of the culture of our country. Today, we have 10,000 hectares of Pais planted in Chile, so big amount, more than 15 of old vines, but 10,000 are Pais. Let's say 95% of plus are planted in Maule, Itata, and Biobío, so in the southern part of Chile, and most of it in the Secano Interior, so in the closer to the Pacific Ocean, in the not to the Andes side, to the coastal range side. A lot of granitic soils. It is a dry farm. It is bush vines, like you can see in this picture, and these are incredible, beautiful vines, and they survive. They are very resistant. Pais is we call it like a rustic variety, so the tannins can be more like edgy, aggressive, or how you want to call it. But the vine it resists the rain, it resists the sun, it resists the diseases, virus. So that is the way, because we are phylloxera free for one side, but for the other side, because it's superpower plant. So it's still alive. So this is the kind of pictures, the kind of views you can get in the south of Chile. And we really feel responsible to preserve these monsters, these beautiful small monsters. And it's not just, when we say the rescue of the variety, it's not just the liquid, it's not just the brand, it's all the culture we have behind. And this is very important because, the farmers, this is not typical industrial wineries with 20, 50, or more than 100 hectares. When you see the trailing system, you see the tractors working, everything properly. This is small. This is 1 to 5 hectares. These are planted in very high density without a space in between. So it's the only way to work the soil is by horse, and everything is done by hand. Because this was not interesting for the wineries, to work with these varieties. It was kind of abandoned, and the people didn't work the land anymore. So now we try to bring the people back to the farm, the horses, the new generations, because they want to escape for the mining business or the fruit business. They don't want to work in the farm. So it's all about this. They will also plant wheat, they will plant the fruit, they will have the cow, they will make the cheese. So it's all around. It's the lifestyle in the farm. So this is the beautiful thing in this area in the south of Chile. Of course, in the north, in Maipo, Colchagua, you still have a lot of old vines, but because it has been more oriented to business, they will replace the old vines into new clonal selection, new rootstock for more productive vines. So that's the way in the northern part is being disappearing faster than in the south. Well, this picture is in our farm. It's in the harvest of the Pais, and this is the way the old guys were working in the farm. So they will get a bottle of wine, and they will get a tortilla, that is a big piece of bread, to go out to the field for the whole day. So this is the way they live the lifestyle in the farm. So
Excellent.
this is for me the Pais in the south of Chile.
And thinking about the viticulture, because we have Pais, and you've done quite a lot of work yourself in holding kind of tastings with producers of Pais, which we call Criolla Chica in Argentina, and also Listan Prieto in the Canaries. Why is it that Pais in Chile was typically head trained, or in a bush vine like this, whereas in Argentina it's grown in a parral?
Well, this is the system they used to do the old guys in the south of Chile, planting in the slopes, in Itata, Maule, in the Secano Interior, in the Pacific, in the mountain range. And this is the way they planted. And in these steep hills is not possible to plant with the parron, with the parronal. So this is the old ways, I think, and we continue doing like this. We are doing new plantations under this system. The good thing is that also in the bush vines, you can protect the bunches from the sun exposure. That these days is something very important with the global warming and the higher temperatures. No.
Excellent. And I think that touches on what Francisco said about the Torrontés as well, is that these old viticulture methods actually have a lot of benefits that we're kind of coming to appreciate again. And we're going to talk a little bit about now your Pais Salvaje, which kind of harks back to the kind of Bolivian tradition of growing on trees, but this was totally accidental. Can you tell me a bit about the wild Pais that you have growing in your vineyard?
Well, these grapes are next to the previous picture, the old bush vines. There is a road in between, and after the road we have a creek with this native forest. And the creek it only have a winter water running, so in the summer is dry. And for more than 100 years, we don't really know, because this is not a vineyard that is registered somehow. It's been there for forever. Since I was a little kid, I was eating the grapes from the trees, no, from these vines that are growing in the trees. And in 2015, we came with the idea to make a wine from these grapes. So that is a very old traditional vineyard in our farm, but it's a kind of new wine from us.
Excellent, fabulous. And you're going to take us through a kind of tasting of Pais. So for many people who might not have actually tasted Pais, what I like to refer to it as kind of a Pinot Noir equivalent, really, for the kind of Criollo varieties. But how would you kind of characterize Pais in the glass? What does it look like? What does it smell like? And what does it taste like?
Well, typically the Pais will be lighter in color, so it's never going to be too dark. Depending the areas, can be a little bit darker, but in general, it's quite light. It's a light body, but the tannins, if they are coming from the nice area, from the correct place, rock soil, the tannins can be very grapey. And for me, this is the super interesting part of the Pais, that when you drink it, when you see it, you feel that it's going to be like a very light juice, but when in your mouth, it's giving a lot of energy. And if it's coming from old vines, if it's coming from a beautiful granite soil, and then the all together, it makes more tension and beautiful aspect in mouth. The aromas is also quite interesting how it can change depending in the areas. In Maule, it tends to be more like red fruit, and some areas can be a little bit more earthy. If you go more to Bio, it's moving to more floral. So we think that because Pais has been so many years here planted, it's really well adapted to the, let's say, micro terroirs. So it's a huge diversity of Pais. So you have to taste them. You have to see if it's coming from Biobío, Itata, or Maule, or depending where in these areas, the wine is going to be completely different. And this is really beautiful. Most of these wines today are made with very low intervention. So they really talk about the place. In particular, the Pais Salvaje at the beginning in 2015, it was, my family is Bouchon, no? I'm the fourth generation from my great grandfather who came from Bordeaux. So of course we have the French roots, and we were very influenced by the Bordeaux winemaking style. So for us took long to learn how to make a Pais, or how to do less intervention. So let's say more Burgundy style of winemaking than Bordeaux, no? And took us some long years to learn. So we started in 15 with the carbonic maceration, 100%. We were afraid of these edgy tannins, as energy of the tannins. We didn't know how the consumer will react about this kind of tannin profile, but we feel that the wine finally it was too similar than other appellations like Beaujolais. So the people will tell me, Julio, it tastes like a Beaujolais, because the carbonic, if it's 100% carbonic, is more the style of the fermentation than the style of the grape or of the place. So you lose identity. So we want to bring a Pais from Maule, from Mingre, from our terroir. So we don't want to be like Beaujolais. That's why finally we decide to stop the carbonic. It was step by step, vintage by vintage, 50%, 30%. Now we don't do it anymore. And the wine is moving to this red fruit, to the more earthiness. And also we get some smoky notes. We had the big wildfires in 2017, and we thought that these smoky notes will be because of the smoke, but the next vintages without the fires, we still have some touch of smoke, and we believe it's coming from the place, not from the fire. It's a beautiful wine. It's a wine that we believe that can age beautiful. We don't know how many years, because it's new from us, and also because the first vintages we did the carbonic, and then it's less, it has less conditions to age. But the ones that we are making from 18, 19, and 20, we believe that it will age beautifully. Also, Pais is a high pH variety. So if you pick it with more alcohol later, it's not going to be beautiful. It's very sensible to the peaking date. So we try to be around 12 degrees alcohol and keep the freshness of this wine.
Excellent, wonderful. And I really encourage everyone to try Pais now and keep following it, because I think even though it's a very historic variety for South America, I think really we're just at the beginning of this new kind of renaissance of Pais. And obviously, Bouchon, you've been planting new Pais, so I think we're really entering a very different chapter for Pais. We're going to move on now and speak to Emily, who's going to open up the discussion. Thank you very much, Julio. We'll come back to you in a bit for VIGNO, but we're going to move on to Emily and open up the discussion to some of the other diversity of old vines that we find in Chile, especially these more ancestral kind of historic vines. So Emily is at the forefront of the kind of new generation of winemakers in Chile and making some incredibly exciting wines with Viña Carmen, and especially under the DO series, which really focuses on looking at unique kind of appellations and specifically old vines. So thank you, Emily, for joining.
Thank you, Amanda. I love the way how you say the kind of new generation.
Well, that's the kind of getting
when you're
old
sort of
now.
starting to step out of it. But thank you. Yes, it's always nice to talk about these vines that I think for a lot of us in winemaking have us very enthused, especially in the last 10, 15 years, where in Chile we've started to see the value and to recognize and try to rescue all of this sort of heritage that we have in terms of viticulture. And I think in terms of diversity, while you showed in your introduction that Chile has quite a lot of vineyards planted that are considered old vines. I don't know what would be considered as old vine, but for me, over 35 years or 40, around 50 is already an old vine. And in terms of diversity, we find many different grape varieties and in many different places. So if you go from, I think from the north to the south, in every region you are able to find vineyards that are over this age, and in terms of and several different varieties. So we in Carmen, we're working with some of them. It's not only Pais, it's not only Carignan, it's not only Semillon. We also find great varieties like Gangnesonian, Julio mentioned it, Carmener vines that are 100 years old, and they really go in line with what has happened through the viticulture history in Chile. So the first thing that we have to understand that in Chile we used to drink a lot of wine. We used to, only 60, 70 years ago, we were drinking 60 liters per capita a year. So the consumption in Chile was quite big. So in every region, they were producing a lot of wine. The production was very different to what we do today. So it was a very simple production. It was red wine, white wine, sometimes everything mixed together. You asked me to talk about field blends, and I think there's where the link between the field blends of the old vines that we find today is due to that, because there wasn't like such a driven or focused in grape varieties and linked to specific sites, but they used to sort of talk to the neighbor and say, do you have some plant material? And that's how they, in some places, they went planting the vineyards, and that is part of the history of what happened. And then obviously, with experience, some sites where it started to get more specific in certain grape varieties, like the Carignan in Maule, that I know we're going to talk about it more deeply. In the south, the Semillon, why it started to be Tata, for example, and that way, and it's how appellations are formed everywhere due to experience. You want a product, you want wine, because you want to consume it, and then you go understanding what is good in different sites. And it isn't a coincidence today that, for example, in regions like Maipo, you find vineyards, they're not that many, but you find quite a few hectares of very old Cabernet Sauvignon, while in Cachapoal, around Peumo, you find very, very old Carmener vines that they didn't even know it was Carmener at the time, but today, we with the understanding of viticulture that we have and this very complex grape variety, that we have learned that it needs sunlight, it needs heat, etc. Does very well in Colchagua and Cachapoal. And you go to Apalta and the very old vineyards of Carmener, and until today, some of them are still inscribed as Merlot. So in terms, I think it's very interesting how this link between the site and the old vineyards that we find for each grape variety, how they're placed in the viticulture map today. And that is a very important learning process for the more modern viticulture, because what happened after this high consumption of wine in Chile, it came down almost to zero at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. It was like 5 liters per capita. And so with so many vineyards planted in Chile, we had to do something about it. And there's where the modern viticulture, I would say it's 35 years ago, where it really started changing. And this experience from before was very important to learn where to place the different grape varieties in Chile. And then I think that the focus of the viticulture and the wine production and the wine industry that Julio mentioned, that it's like that, it went towards export market. And what we had to do was think, what are people drinking in the export market? And probably Pais wasn't one of them. Carignan, not either. Semillon, not so much. So those grape varieties, they started coming down in production. Some families kept on working their vineyards, and they ended up going into bulk wine, but it was only 15 years ago, I would say, or 10 years ago, where we actually started saying, okay, hang on, we have a good viticulture map today where we place productive grape varieties that are successful in the export market, that there is a high demand for them, but we also have something very important here in Chile. We have a heritage value in terms of viticulture, and we have to start to look after it. So that is what I think where we've put a lot of focus. For us, for example, in Carmen, we are an old winery, very focused in French varieties and in modern viticulture. And I think we've participated very actively in this modern side of the production. And we wanted to take part of our responsibility in how to look after these old vineyards. So because if you see, for example, I have some numbers from 94 until today, Gangnesonian went from 11,000 hectares to 41,000 hectares. Okay, so that's one side of the story. But then you have Semillon, for example, that goes from 30,000 hectares in the 60s to 700 or 800 hectares today. Pais went from 94, from 16,000 hectares to 10,000 hectares. So you see how they're coming down. So I think every one of us working here in wine in Chile have to take a little bit of responsibility and how to look after this. Do we want all these old vines to be part of the big companies, or do we want to maintain part of the culture of the people and the families that have been working with these vineyards for many generations? I think it's interesting to keep it with the families that have managed these vineyards for so many years. I think there's a lot of value behind that. So that's why we came up with a project called Carmen DO. We started 5 years ago, where we started selecting. Obviously, we would love to make every old vine that we could find, but I think it's important to focus and take responsibility for certain sites. And what we basically do is work with growers, so we don't own these vineyards, and we work hand by hand, and we buy the fruit off them. And we actually just act as a platform where we source the wines from a specific site that has heritage value, is linked to a family that has been producing in this site for generations, and then just take it to wine and assure it's a wine from a specific site. And with long-term contracts where we ensure a certain price for the grape, and it gives more stability to these growers to carry on working with these vineyards. So today we're working with 3 different wines. We work with a Semillon Data, with a blend that comes, it's not actually a field blend, it's a blend from Carignan, Grenache, and Pais from Maule. It's sort of a field blend, but not so much. So I think it ended up being, because you know, in Maule at the beginning, they used to have most of the 100 years ago, it was most of the vineyards were Pais, and then with the intention of trying to change, improve the quality, Carignan came in very strong, and so most of these Pais vineyards were replaced by Carignan. And like 10 years ago, with all this, I think it was the French winemaker with this that started pushing the old vines, went with some Grenache canes and suggested to graft on the old Pais vines that were left over. So it ends up being a field blend, but it's not really, because I mean, it's a coincidence of the facts that went happening through history. So it ends up being a blend of Carignan, Grenache, and Pais, which is very interesting, and it's a wine that I very much enjoy. It's called Matorral Chileno. And then and then that is the wine that I was going to present today. Is Semillon. That is the third wine, and this comes from a Palta. So that's another thing that makes you think Semillon and a Palta, and actually there's quite a few plantations of Semillon. It does very well there. Almost it's dry. And these last seasons that have been very hot, they have done one irrigation a year, but during the season they don't have. These are small producers don't have access to irrigation, and it makes you think how necessary it is to irrigate in certain places. I think sometimes in viticulture we're very fond of irrigating, and sometimes some varieties are robust enough and the site provides to be able to have a dry farming production. And this is one of those cases, and it does very well. It's surrounded by Carmener, and which makes it kind of makes sense if you think of it like as a reference of Bordeaux. And well, this family have been working with owned this vineyard for over 60 years, and it's gone down generation after generation. And we believe it has a lot of value. It used to go into very cheap wine bulk, and since 2015 we started making it as a single block wine, and I would encourage to taste it. It's very unique. It's very fleshy. It has a lot of volume. We've been actually working with picking dates to see how sometimes it's sort of like a little bit of a bomb. At the beginning, we used to find it's like a bit of a bomb, very heavy, like a very complex wine. And we've been working with picking dates and everything. And I think it's a very serious white wine that also changes a little bit the approach to this type of wine. 10 years ago, white wine in Chile was a terrace wine, and now this wine can sit next to a red wine at the table and not be shy at all. So
absolutely. I think what's really exciting about your Semillon and also, some of the Semillons, Bouchon has an excellent Semillon, and some of the old vine Semillon that you find in Chile and Argentina, is that it's this totally different style. It's got a lot of, personality. They're very bold wines. You describe yours as a little bit austere on the nose, which is perhaps true that these are more wines that are focused in the palate and the texture. Which I think, is a really nice kind of movement happening in South American whites at the moment. Wonderful. Talking quickly, my last question before we move on to Andres for you is, Semillon was such an important grape for Chile and for Argentina. Why do you think it lost its ground so dramatically?
I think it definitely has to do with what I said when Chile made this shift from consuming wine locally to export market, and the drive was completely focused on the grape varieties that were being consumed abroad in big importing markets, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and we started moving towards that line, and also in sites where you could produce a good Cabernet Sauvignon or a good Carmener. In the case of Apalta, commercially it was more productive, and it would be a better business to change this grape variety for something else. And that is a lot of what happened not only with Semillon, that with Semillon was very drastic. It went down from 30,000 hectares to 800. It happens with Carignan, it happens with Pais, and then the mix changed in what we have planted today in terms of what the most planted grape variety in Chile is Cabernet Sauvignon in the world.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's because it is the easiest grape variety and that it does well everywhere. It's definitely pushed because of a market situation. And this is no exception. And I'm pretty sure why there was so much Semillon before is because it has a good production, yields well. This is a plantation of 1958, and it yields 9 tons a hectare after 60 years. So it's a very healthy vineyard that has good production, And the switch they had before is that abundance was better, which is very different to what we do today. So I think it has to do with when and where.
Super. And I'm so excited that these these varieties are becoming in demand now, so that we can see more of the diversity that still exists in Chile and also Argentina. So thank you, Emily. Now we're going to hop over the Andes. And we're with Andres Vignono, who is the winemaker at VIGNO and doing some really exciting wines with old vines of Malbec, Chardonnay, and Cabernet Sauvignon. So he's going to take us through some of the more international varieties, which are equally just as old, some of them over 100 years. So thank you so much, Andres, for joining us in the middle of your vintage.
Thanks to you. So, well, we have heard our friends from Chile, and in this side of the mountains, we have some similitudes, some things that are pretty the same as the origins of, you know, the grape plantations in America. But after we had a difference, and it happened actually in 1865, when a president in Argentina hired very well-known professionals from France. He had a different mind from Argentinian production. And among this professional was an agronomist called Michel Pouget, who brought a lot of prephyloxeric vines from the south of France. Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, Semillon, and after Chardonnay, as Cabernet Franc, as Merlot, and a lot of French varieties. So the consumption in Argentina really increased a lot, and we have been facing this kind of, you know, fight between the very high yield production varieties, as Criolla, for example, or Tempranillo, and the French varieties, as we know, as our, you know, grandparents know here, they call the small berry bunches just French, uva francesa. And after we realized that was Malbec and Cabernet and a lot of varieties. So the consumption in Argentina really was crazy. It touched at some point 96 liters per capita. And after the 70s and the 80s, it was a sort of change in the mind, going on pointing to the quality. Always the local market has been the main market for Argentinian wineries, but also with the arrival of, you know, international winemakers, as Paul Hobbs, for example, in this case, that start consulting the year I was born, 1988. And after in 1988, founding VIGNO Cobos, we have a great approach about this kind of varieties. So you will see in Argentina a lot of this kind of projects founded by people from France and from Napa, for example, also from Italy. And generations that has learned a lot from them, but also they have learned a lot from our history. So this is part of the team of VIGNO Cobos, and we share with Paul Hobbs the direction of the wines with two very different approaches. Of course, Paul, it's based in Napa, and I'm based in Argentina, but I have a great Italian background, and it means that we will have different cultures, and this mixture of culture really marks what's happening all around Argentina. It's just an example. So when we go straight to the varieties today, Argentina has a lot of regions, as you know, Patagonia as the north part, and obviously Mendoza and San Juan. Inside Mendoza and San Juan, we will be focused in two main places called Valle de Uco and Luján de Cuyo, that are the main appellations of Mendoza, and probably the appellation well known in the world from Argentina. And we will be focused principally in Luján de Cuyo, which was called the first zone, but it's not the only place where we can find old vines. So when we talk about old vines, we can mostly find Malbec, of course, but when we talk about white, you will find a lot of Semillon around. Normally, when we think in the history of Mendoza, Semillon and Malbec were the main varieties of the beginnings of the last century. So quality grapes were Semillon and Malbec, and after we have all the criollas that were for high yield. That was like roughly recognized at that time. With the years, we can go to the next slide, please. With the years, Semillon was took out, the same case in Chile, and changed mainly for Chardonnay, that was very looked for the export market, and probably very well known from Burgundy. So a better reputed variety, but we have still a lot of this kind of old vines, Semillon, spread in our soils. Obviously, you can find also Chardonnay, and you can find a lot of Criolla, Criolla Chica, Criolla Grande, and one of the only native varieties in Argentina that is called Torrontés, as our friend from Malbec presented at the very beginning. So whites are also present in these old vines vineyards, and today is a great, I would say, movement from young winemakers to rescue these old vines, not just from Mendoza, also from Patagonia. Obviously, the star here, it's Malbec, and you can find a lot of different Malbecs in a lot of different soils. Obviously, the kind of pruning or the trellis system that's very present in Argentina, because the slopes are not so marked as in Chile, and we can really use our very gentle slope to cultivate in that system, VSOP. And what you will see is that the Malbec from Argentina is pretty different from the Malbec of Cahors, for example. And you can see in this picture how small are the berries, how loose is the bunch, and how color is the stem. So we become crazy when we see plantations like this. And in Viña we have a lot of focus, especially in our Romario appellation tier, and obviously our single vineyards and Cobos Malbec there was pointed from the very, very beginning in non-vines. So rescuing this part of the heritage of Argentina is just a part, but also the wines are pretty amazing. Yields are low, and depending on where you are, if you have more clay in the soil profile, for example, in Pedriel or for example in Lulunta, you will find rounded and probably more horizontal wines. But when you go to Uco with a lot of limestone in the soil profile and more sandy loamy soils, like for example in Villa Ortiz or La Consulta, that are the most ancient parts of Uco Valley to be planted because of an altitude thing, you will find very vertical mineral wines, a lot of, like dark tea notes that are super impressive, super complex. So the wine we have today, the Zingaretti vineyard, it's called Zingaretti because of the owners, but more than the owners, the people who planted this vineyard more than 100 years ago. And this property belonged to the family until 2016 when Viña Cobos bought it, but also Viña Cobos was working with them for 10 years before that. So we keep the name and the front label in honor to these people who really keep the vines when yields were so low, are really trusting that quality was a matter more than the quantity. And what we have here, it's a wine that comes from a single block, but more than a single block, comes from 3 different spots inside the block. The soil profile changes dramatically in this place. All the alluvial formation marks that sometimes you have very heterogeneous pieces of soil, and sometimes you have homogeneous pieces of soil depending on where you are. And the path of the water really marks what's happening. And this 1.1 hectare block has 3 different kind of soils. It's a big spot of limestone that is in the surface in a part, and after we can see that it goes down in the map, and we have a sandy loamy soil, and in the top part we have some clay on it. So we pick it separately, the three parts. So we have 3 different vinifications. The part that has more stones has part of whole bunch present in the fermentation, and the rest is all the steam. All ferments with native yeast, and after we press it and it goes straight to barrels, no fining, no filtering, and no nothing. And that's wine, it's everything like handmade. But actually we study a lot the place, and we study a lot what we can get from there. So year by year we have a field blend, but not doing in the blend, and in the field it's made in the glass with the best phases of each part of the block. The aging is pretty long, it's 18 months. This particular vintage has, it was like a hot vintage, a warm vintage with very nice cool nights. So we could go up in the oak composition, 55%, but depending on the year, we go between 45 to 55 in order to put all the profile aligned with the type of wine.
Interesting. And a question for you, Andres, because when Paul Hobbs really started Cobos, it was very much with a focus on old vines and the potential that he really saw with old vine Malbec and Cabernet Sauvignon. For you, in your experience, because you've worked with new vines of Malbec elsewhere as well, what is it that really changes about the quality of Malbec over time? And what's the kind of sweet spot? When do Malbec vines really kind of change in character?
Well, I will say depending mostly in the place. When you have rocky soils, normally the first 10 years you get super expressive Malbecs, a lot of energy on them, but a lack of finesse, I will say. After 30 years, for example, or 40 years, you really see how it shifts. I will say that the sweet spot for a good production in Malbec and very good quality and finesse could be between 20 and 40 years. After 40 years, economically talking, that's, you are losing money probably, but you get a lot of complexity and finesse. And below 10 years, you probably will have more fruit side and power.
Excellent, super. And just one last question, how old are these Zingaretti vines?
Well, it was the very first book in Argentina to be, to really count the vineyards was in 1930, and this vineyard was inscribed in 1930. So at least that one, but the family says that it's more than 110 years old. So it was already existing in 1930 for sure, but they told us that it was planted in 1910 or 12.
Excellent. Super old vines. Fabulous.
Vines, yeah.
Thank you. All right. So we'll move back down to Chile and to Julio, and this time with a different hat on. So now president of VIGNO, which is one of the really interesting developments in recent years, I think in the New World in general, actually, not just for South America, but in terms of creating an appellation for old vines and really kind of focusing in on Carignan as something worth kind of recognizing and protecting. So Julio, can you please just explain to us what is VIGNO and why was it developed for old vine Carignan?
Well, VIGNO is Viñadores de Carignan. This is a group of 16 producers today that we work like a DOC. It's not a legal or officially DOC in Chile because it doesn't exist. In Chile, we only have the DO appellation. That means that it refers to a place, no? But we don't have rules. In VIGNO, we have our own rules. Must be old vines, 35 years old minimum. Must be 85% of Carignan, bush vines, and dry farm, coming from a specific place that is the Secano Interior of Valle del Maule. And then VIGNO, that is Viñadores de Carignan, is the name, must be used by everybody on the same size, with a minimum size. And this name VIGNO must be bigger than the name of the producer. So like the appellations in Europe. And this is quite interesting because it's the first time that a group of producers work together for a same purpose. And it started in 2010, so we are celebrating this year our 10 years old. I am kind of new. Bouchon, we started in 2015, and so I am not one of the guys who started. Andres Sanchez and Derek Mosman from Garage, they are the first ones who start. It's a beautiful thing because it also is looking for the rescue of the viticulture, the lifestyle, the farming in the Secano Interior in Maule. It's the way it started. You have to understand that 10 years ago, the price of a kilo of Carignan was $10, $20 per kilo. Today, the minimum the people is paying for Carignan in the area for a Vigno is $1, but it's $1 to $1.50 the kilo. So this is something that you can bring out of the poorness to a family if you pay these kind of prices. And so this is something really important, something social behind the Vigno. Also, I think Vigno is playing a very important role in the real Chilean wines, we call it, not more in the export market, not more in the industrial wine, because for example, these days normally the Bordeaux blends will be the high rates from Chile, the gold medals and the higher ratings always be the same Bordeaux blends. These days you have a couple of these vignos playing the top league somehow. And this is quite important. Also, you see in the whites, you see Semillons like Carmen Semillon playing the best ratings against the typical Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blancs. And this is interesting, not because of the medal, not because of the 90 plus, but means that now we have wines with character, with history, with a lot of authenticity. So this is the role that Vigno is playing. I think Vigno is one of the first group doing this, but after that there is a group, not official group, but there is growers of Pais. We make the Semillon sessions together with Carmen, Emily, and another 5 producers every year. So we have a group, not official group, of Semillon producers working together. And I think this is the best way of how we can bring the interesting wines to the market, somehow. And so Vigno is, I think, a very important group in Chile. You have to know that Chileans, we are not used to play in group. We are very individualist. So I don't know how they started with this group in 10 years ago, but it's really beautiful. I am the president today. It's lucky because now they are used to work together. So for me, it's not a big deal. And quite interesting. So Vigno, I think, is a must to taste. We have like 5 subzones of Vigno, some of them more to the interior of the valley, warmer, some of them closer to the ocean. So when we make these tastings, we show the micro areas, and it's really incredible how the wines are performing or showing depending from where they come.
Excellent. And Vigno is now celebrating its 10th anniversary, I believe, and I think it, as you said, I think it really kind of shows this great communal effort to kind of protect the old vines and give them more value, not only in the export market, but empower the growers and the people that have been caring for these vines. I know we need to wrap up because everyone's got to get back out and make wine, but I just wanted to open up the question to everyone to say kind of what is the greatest challenge in your opinion in kind of retaining and protecting these old vines, having such a kind of wealth of old vines in Argentina and Chile. What do you see as the kind of greatest challenge moving forward in making sure that we keep them and don't lose them in the next decade or so to come?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is to get the bottle of wine to the right place, because I think we are very in line working and producing these wines from specific sites, but it's all it would be a failure if we don't achieve to get these wines to the correct places where people will appreciate what is behind. Because in the end, for everybody, for small growers, for big companies, for whoever is working with all vines, we have to take it to a bottle of wine, and that has to be drunk and appreciated for what it is. Sounds simple, but I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we have today, is to give these wines a space in the market, It doesn't matter if it's focused on wine geeks, restaurants or supermarkets or whatever, but it has to be in the right place, and it has to finish it. That's the end of the chain, and that's the only reason why these small producers are going to keep on hanging on to these old vines if they have the value at the end of the chain. I think that's something very important that we have to carry on pushing with initiatives like what Julio was mentioning. I think working together to communicate to what is behind everything. I think this needs a bit more content to be communicated towards the consumer.
Excellent. And hopefully we've got lots of sommeliers listening and keen to put some of these old vines on their wine lists in nice restaurants. Did anyone else have an interesting opinion to add to that question?
Well, it's you know, Chile is I think Argentina has less the problem than Chile, but Chile is really well known in the US under $10. It's more supermarket oriented, no? And these wines that we have been showing today from Chile, at least, these are wines that are $20, $25 retail. Oh, I don't exactly know, Carmen, but they are not expensive. But from Chile, they are expensive somehow. So it's a mid-price category, and I think as Emily said, is we need to find a place to promote, to show, to taste these wines, and we need to make sure the people will understand this. And this is hard work we have been doing from the last years, and has been hard. It's not easy. So we will keep doing it.
And Andres, I'd like to kind of come in to you here, because I think you have an interesting perspective in terms of, you know, these vineyards becoming, as you said, it's impossible to kind of make money unless you're really selling them as premium wines. So what about in Argentina in terms of making sure that you can keep these vineyards? You know, what price do you need to be starting to sell at?
Yeah, the price of the wines is not the key issue. The key issue is that most of these small vineyards are owned by small families that has to survive. So the key role has to be played by the wineries, who has to be, you know, fair with the prices of a property that really produce very low yields, and to keep this family healthy. Otherwise, the business goes down, and you know, it's money that they need to survive, not just for great expenses. And after translated to a good wine, it has possibility to be sold in at least $30 in the used market, could be an option. But this is, as I said before, less important than actually keeping families in a good way.
Excellent. Super. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you spending the time sharing your kind of wealth of information and knowledge about old vines in South America. And I'd really like to encourage everyone listening to find out more about these old vines. You can visit South America Wine Guide, where we've got lots of information, and the book coming out next month about South American vines, and take a look at the website of Bouchon, Cobos, Carmen, and also El Esteco, where you can find out a lot more about their old vines and their wines. And cheers to you all. I hope you have a good evening, and thank you so much for your help, and thank you so much for everyone listening in, and I hope you enjoy some of the old vines of South America.
Thank you, Amanda.
Bye. Ciao.
Thanks
a lot.
Bye,
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, Andres.